I'm afraid I glanced away for a moment. Did we see the all clear to go?
I think we did, Your Honor.
Okay. Can somebody tell me what the all lost time is, please?
You know, Your Honor, I'm not quite sure. Seems like we'll get an update when they have it, but we're not sure yet.
Okay, we'll update all lost time. Okay. But I take it we are cleared to start.
Yes, Your Honor.
This is the case of the estate of Genesis Petrillo versus Peony Estates et al. Am I in the right courtroom?
You are.
It's always a good start if I'm in the right courtroom. There's a civil matter involving either battery or negligence. Is the plaintiff ready to proceed? And do you have any preliminary matters?
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to make appearances?
Absolutely.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Elizabeth Grant. I'm joined today by my co-counsel, Azam John Muhammad.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, Mr. John Muhammad.
And Meredith Fenyo.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
Today, we represent the estate of Genesis Petrillo, and after opposing counsel has the opportunity to introduce themselves, we do have a couple housekeeping matters we'd like to go through with the court.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much. Counsel for the defense, why don't you enter your appearances?
Yes, and thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Dylan Horowitz. I'm joined by my co-counsel, Michael Wilson.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
And Adrian Huntley.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
We represent the defendant in today's case, Harper Martini.
Good afternoon.
Ms. Martini, how are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Okay, back to preliminary matters, I guess. Counsel for plaintiff, go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor. First, we'd like to invoke Midland's Rules of Evidence 603 and 615, which constructively swear in and sequester all of the witnesses in today's case, except for party representatives.
And does the plaintiff have a party representative?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, and my assumption is Ms. Martini is the defense party representative. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so ordered. Go ahead. Next.
Next, Your Honor, yes. We'd like the court to take note of stipulation 3, which states that exhibits 1 through 10 are already in evidence in today's case and may be referenced by either party during opening statements.
Sure. Okay, no problem. Go ahead.
Next, Your Honor, we'd like the court to note that originally plaintiff brought 2 claims, a battery claim against Harper Martini and a negligence per se claim against Peony Estates. We'd like the court to note that that second claim of negligence per se was dismissed during summary judgment, and today we're solely pursuing the battery claim against Ms. Martini.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Last, Your Honor, we'd just like to ask that if for some point during today's trial you're not able to see or hear any of us, please feel free to interrupt us and let us know.
I shall indeed. We'll deal
Thank
with
you, Your Honor.
We'll deal with the technology as best we can. It's worked so far.
Hopefully it continues to work, Your Honor.
Knock on wood. Yes, okay.
With that, Your Honor, plaintiff is ready to proceed to opening statements.
Okay, marvelous. How about counsel for the defense? Do you have any preliminary matters?
Yeah, just a couple quick things, Your Honor. First, since it's our first time in your courtroom, we'd just like to know about your preferences for screen sharing. Would you like us to ask permission before sharing exhibits, or should we just announce that we're doing it for the record?
Just note for the record, the unusual part of Zoom is you have to do it publicly before it's admitted. Not a problem. Just note for the record you're sharing your screen and what you're sharing.
Yes, Your Honor. And I would just like to bring to your attention that due to space constraints, our counsel will be seated during speeches and examinations.
Not a problem.
And with that, the defense is ready as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I just saw a note that the all lost time is 2:48. Timekeepers, please take note and help keep us on track. I think we're ready to begin. Is counsel for the plaintiff ready to begin their opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to proceed?
Have at it.
Thank you. She killed for control. Harper Martini is pacing. She's in her office, at a winery she owns called Peony Estates. She's pacing because it's June 7th. Because tomorrow, her daughter is getting married to a man named Genesis Petrillo. You'll learn that Harper Martini, she's been trying to stop this wedding for months. First, she tried to talk her daughter out of the wedding, but it didn't work. So she threatened Mr. Petrillo directly, but it didn't work. So she offered Mr. Petrillo $300,000 to walk away, but it didn't work. And now she's out of time. So she takes the weapon available to her: pesticides. She walks out of her office, sprays those pesticides into a bottle of wine, and gives that wine as a gift to Mr. Petrillo on the day before his wedding. An act of anger, desperation, of control. She killed for control. Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Grant, and I and my co-counsel today, we represent the estate of Genesis Petrillo. We're here today because in the hours after Mr. Petrillo drank that wine, he passed away. And today, his estate, it's suing the defendant, Harper Martini, for battery. In order for you to find the defendant liable for battery, we have to prove to you the defendant poisoned Mr. Petrillo. She did so intentionally. And then when she did, she caused Mr. Petrillo harm. Now, today's case isn't criminal. We don't have to prove those three things to you beyond a reasonable doubt. No. Today's case is civil, and we have to prove them to you by what's called a preponderance of the evidence. And members of the jury, that just means more likely than not. More likely than not, did the defendant poison Genesis Petrillo? That's the question you're here to answer today. So how do we start to answer that question? Well, before today's trial, both parties admitted Genesis Petrillo's death certificate. So it's undisputed that Mr. Petrillo's official cause of death was pesticide poisoning. Pesticides will show you the defendant used at Peony Estates. And it's undisputed that the most likely source of that pesticide was pesticide-contaminated wine. The wine will show you the defendant gave to Mr. Petrillo. Today, you'll learn that the defendant and Mr. Petrillo, they didn't get along. You'll hear from Mr. Petrillo's close friend, Angel Rodriguez, who'll tell you that the very day Genesis Petrillo was poisoned, the defendant threatened to kill him. The defendant was seen with the same type of pesticides later found in Mr. Petrillo's bloodstream, and the defendant somehow knew that Mr. Petrillo had been poisoned before anyone told her. And then you'll hear what happened with that bottle of wine. Wedding caterer Sam Arnold will tell you the defendant set aside a very specific bottle of wine for Mr. Petrillo, and when she did, she left it with a very specific instruction. Genesis Petrillo alone was to drink it. Then you'll hear what happened after Mr. Petrillo did drink that wine. Dr. Jimin Quan will tell you that after Mr. Petrillo was rushed to the hospital, he passed away. She'll tell you that Genesis Petrillo died from pesticide poisoning. A poisoning we'll prove to you today was the intentional act of the defendant. Members of the jury, by the end of today's case, we'll show you that she killed for control. And that's why, after you've seen all of the evidence, heard all of the testimony, we'll ask you to find the defendant liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Opening statement for the defense, Your Honor.
You bet. We're just going to take a little break between each element, so to make sure that the judges have the opportunity to fill out their scores.
Of course, take your time.
You bet. Okay. Counsel for the defense, you ready?
Yes, Your Honor. Opposing counsel, members of the jury. This was a poisoning, but it wasn't pesticides. Harper Martini is like any mother, protective over the one she loves, especially her only daughter, Casey. But Harper isn't perfect. When Genesis, Casey's fiance, came into their lives, of course, Harper was skeptical. Like any parent, she wanted her child to find the perfect partner. So yes, as Miss Grant described, things could be tense, arguments were had, but they came from a place of love. And that's why on the night of the rehearsal dinner, Miss Martini tried to make amends. You'll learn that she gathered everyone's attention to the front of the room because she wanted everyone to know that the young couple had her support. And she gave Genesis a bottle of Cara wine. Members of the jury, June 7th was like any rehearsal dinner, a celebration. And like any groom-to-be, Mr. Petrillo celebrated with some drinks. You'll learn about how he ordered tequila, how he drank champagne, how he drank from his flask, how he drank that entire bottle of Cara wine. And you'll learn about how he became sick, how he was nauseous, vomiting, and he needed to go to the hospital. When he was eventually rushed into the ER, he was showing signs of alcohol poisoning, and he slipped into a coma and passed away. Members of the jury, what happened early on the morning of June 8th was a tragic poisoning, but it wasn't pesticides. Now, in today's case, the plaintiff has the burden of proof. That means they have to prove to you the elements of civil battery, that Miss Martini poisoned the Cara wine with pesticides, that she intended to do so, and that drinking that wine was the direct and proximate cause of Genesis Petrillo's death. And they have to prove all that to you by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning that their explanation has to be more likely than not. But members of the jury, the plaintiff will fail to meet that burden today because while this was a poisoning, it wasn't pesticides. And you don't just have to take my word for it, because we'll begin today by calling Miss Austin Lewis to the stand, the head winemaker at Harper Martini's Winery. The plaintiff will want you to believe that a drop of pesticides can kill, but the head winemaker will tell you that's not quite right. Instead, Ms. Lewis will describe that actually pesticides can safely be in wine. And I want you to remember that because we'll next hear from Dr. Renee Cannon, an expert in toxicology. Dr. Cannon reviewed the treating physician's materials and she'll tell you about alcohol poisoning, an alternative explanation for Genesis Petrillo's death that the plaintiff overlooked. Finally, we'll feel for Ms. Harper Martini herself today. Ms. Martini will be the first to tell you that she wasn't perfect, that things between her and Genesis could have been better, but the last person she would ever want to hurt is Casey. Ms. Martini will also describe that she saw Mr. Petrillo drinking heavily on the night of June 7th, just hours before he passed away. Members of the jury, what happened early on the morning of June 8th was a tragedy. But we have to consider all of the facts, look at all of the evidence, because while it was a poisoning, it wasn't pesticides. And that's why, at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mr. Adrian Huntley, will come before you and ask you find Harper Martini not liable.
Thank you. One moment, please. Okay, does the plaintiff have any witnesses to call here today?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Angel Rodriguez.
Angel Rodriguez. Ms. Rodriguez, you've been previously sworn. I want you to stay centered on your camera there, and I want you to keep your voice up so everybody in the Zoom world can hear what you have to say. Thank you very much. Proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Rodriguez. Could you tell the court a bit about why you're here today?
I'm here for Genesis. He was my best friend, and he died 2 years ago on his wedding day.
How did you know Mr. Petrillo?
Genesis and his fiancée, Casey, we were all really close. They had asked me to be their maid of honor, but instead, I'm the one that took Genesis to the hospital the night he died.
Ms. Rodriguez, it's important that the jury understand the circumstances around Mr. Petrillo's death. Do you remember the night of June 7th, 2019?
Of course. It was their rehearsal dinner, so we were all at Peony Estates for the weekend. Their wedding was the next day, so that night was supposed to be informal, fun.
Were you with Mr. Petrillo that night?
I was. I remember thinking the night started out fine. The guests got there, that there was dinner and dancing, everyone was hanging out. It felt exciting at first.
Did you see Mr. Petrillo drink anything that night?
There was a bottle of wine. Casey's mom gave Genesis a bottle of wine, and I saw him drink from it.
What happened next?
It was maybe an hour later, and Genesis seemed, I don't know, disoriented. He was slurring his words and stumbling, and pretty soon he was a mess, so I tried to take him up to his room.
How was Mr. Petrillo behaving at that point?
He was practically unconscious. He started throwing up, and I was panicking. I just kept trying to get him to drink water, but he couldn't seem to keep it down. And so then I went to go get help, but he passed out on the floor.
What did you do?
I called 911. I didn't know what else to do.
Was there an ambulance?
There was, and I went in it with Genesis. I remember his eyes were glazed over. I couldn't get him to look at me. I held his hand. I was so scared.
Ms. Rodriguez, what happened when you got to the hospital?
I went to the waiting room for hours after they admitted him. I tried to call his family, but no one answered. And eventually—
Objection, Your Honor. To the statement that she called his family and no one answered, to relevance.
Ms. Grant,
Response.
what say you there?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, the relevance of Ms. Rodriguez making calls and no one answering, her not communicating with anyone, is us laying foundation. If I may make an offer of proof.
Sure.
Ms. Rodriguez will later testify that she ran into the defendant the following morning, and before Ms. Rodriguez could communicate to the defendant or anyone else, the defendant mentioned that Genesis Petrillo had been poisoned. This is evidence that no one else, no one that Ms. Rodriguez called, could have possibly alerted the defendant to that fact, and demonstrates that the defendant poisoned Mr. Petrillo in today's case.
Based on your proffer, I'm going to overrule the objection and allow you to proceed. You better get there, though.
Yes, Your Honor. What happened next, Ms. Rodriguez?
I learned that Genesis was in a coma, so I went back to Peony Estates to try to find Casey. I brought her back with me to the hospital, but we got there and Genesis had died. We were too late. It was terrible.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez, for walking us through that night. I'd like to shift a bit and talk about the defendant, Harper Martini. Do you know her?
I do. She's Casey's mom and she owns Peony Estates.
Have you ever seen the defendant and Ms. Petrillo fight?
I have. They fought a lot.
Objection, Your Honor, to character evidence. May I be heard?
Sure.
Any testimony about Miss Martini fighting with Mr. Petrillo in the past serves no basis in this case other than to prove propensity, to show that because Miss Martini may have fought with Genesis Petrillo in the past, she would be more inclined to poison Genesis on June 7th.
Ms. Grant.
Yes, Your Honor. We're not using this testimony for a character purpose, for its propensity. That previous Miss Martini fought with Mr. Petrillo, and so that's what they did on the night of June 7th. Your Honor, we're using this to demonstrate motive, which we're permitted to do under Midland's Rule of Evidence 404B2.
I'm going to allow it. I'll overrule the objection and allow the question. Go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Rodriguez, are you familiar with a voicemail from May 12th of 2019?
I am. After Genesis died, Casey showed me a voicemail that he had sent to Miss Martini that day.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is displaying what's already in evidence as Exhibit 8.
Can you make it a little bigger?
Your Honor, we'll zoom in just a moment.
Okay.
Ms. Rodriguez, is this a transcript of that voicemail?
It is.
And what did Mr. Petrillo say to the defendant in this voicemail?
Mr. Petrillo said that he and Casey were moving to France right after the wedding, and that Miss Martini would never see her daughter again.
So that's about a month before the rehearsal dinner. When was the next time that you saw them?
On the day of the rehearsal dinner, I saw them a bunch of times. That morning, I heard Miss Martini yell that Genesis should just leave or she would make him disappear.
Thank you, Ms. Fenyo. We can take that down. Ms. Rodriguez, when did you next see the defendant?
Maybe an hour before the rehearsal dinner, I saw her carrying this canister of pesticide, so I asked her what it was for.
Objection, Your Honor, to a lack of foundation on how Ms. Rodriguez would know that what Ms. Martini was carrying was in fact pesticides.
Ms. Grant.
Yes, Your Honor. We believe that this is a rationally based perception allowable under MRE 701.
Why don't you ask her? I'm going to sustain the objection. You might want to ask a little foundational question, though.
No problem, Your Honor. Ms. Rodriguez, could you tell what the defendant was carrying?
I could. It was this canister that said pesticide on it, so I figured it was a canister of pesticide.
And what did the defendant tell you that it was for?
She said that it was for Genesis, because Genesis was such a pest. Then she said she was kidding, she guessed.
Did you see them interact at the dinner itself?
Like I said, she made a toast to Genesis.
Well, After you went to the hospital that night, Ms. Rodriguez, did you speak to the defendant again?
I did. The next morning, while I was at Peony Estates looking for Casey, I ran into Miss Martini first.
And what did the defendant say to you?
Before I could say anything, before I could even tell her that Genesis was sick, she looked me dead in the eyes and said, Genesis got poisoned? Oh no, guess we'll have to cancel the wedding. I have no idea how she knew Genesis was poisoned.
Thank you for your time today, Ms. Rodriguez. Your Honor, nothing further at this time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Horowitz, would you like to cross-examine this witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Would you like me to wait a moment or
Yes, please.
should I proceed?
Give us a moment. Have at it.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Rodriguez. My name is Dylan Horowitz, and I have some questions for you on behalf of Harper Martini.
Okay.
I first just want to clear up some details about when you called the ambulance for Mr. Petrillo.
Sure.
You were helping Mr. Petrillo when he lost consciousness.
I was trying to help him, but I couldn't, so I called 911.
And you called 911 at 12:42 a.m. on June 8th. Is that right?
Yes, that sounds right.
Now, you didn't leave your friend alone before the ambulance arrived, did you?
Not after I called 911, no.
So you can be sure that Mr. Petrillo didn't consume any more alcohol after you called 911.
Absolutely, yes. I was with him the whole time.
Thank you for clearing that up, Ms. Rodriguez. I want to talk now about earlier in the night at that rehearsal dinner. You were there when Miss Martini gave Mr. Petrillo that 2019 Cara wine.
I was. It was during the toast section of the evening around 10 p.m.
Right, it was when she was making a toast.
That's right.
She got everyone's attention.
She did, yes. She used a microphone.
And only when everyone was watching did Miss Martini give Mr. Petrillo that wine.
I couldn't say if every single person was watching, but most of us were looking at her.
Let's talk about what happened with that bottle. First, Miss Martini poured a glass for Mr. Petrillo.
She did.
Miss Martini's daughter, Casey Soto, was sitting next to Mr. Petrillo when she poured that glass.
I believe when she poured the glass, Genesis was standing next to her, actually, on this sort of stage area.
But Mr. Petrillo brought that glass back to the table,
That's right.
quickly drank that glass,
In a couple of minutes, yes.
and then after drinking that glass, Mr. Petrillo poured another one.
He did.
Mr. Petrillo offered a glass to everyone at that table.
Yes, but no one but me accepted.
Now, Miss Martini didn't stop Mr. Petrillo from offering anyone else a glass, right?
No, she didn't have to. No one really took him up on the offer.
Well, like you said, you took one of those glasses.
That's right, but I didn't end up drinking any of the wine.
Well, when you took that glass, you didn't see Miss Martini run over to the table to stop you from drinking it.
Not that I saw, no.
Miss Martini never told you to not drink that wine.
She didn't need to. I didn't end up drinking it.
Miss Rodriguez, you actually did take a sip of that wine, isn't that right?
I took a sip, but I spit it out. I didn't swallow it.
And so when you took that sip, Miss Martini didn't do anything, right?
Not that I saw, no.
Well, I want to talk about what you saw Mr. Petrillo do throughout that night.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier to Miss Grant that you saw him drink that Cara wine. But that's
I
not
saw-
all you saw him drink that night, was it?
I also saw him have a flute of champagne.
And in addition to that champagne, you saw him drink from his flask.
I saw him take a sip, but I couldn't even tell you what was in it.
After a while, you started to worry about Mr. Petrillo.
I did, yes, after he'd had a few glasses of the wine.
You asked him if he wanted to go upstairs and rest.
I did, yes, I thought he might want to make an early night the night before his wedding.
He said no to you.
That's right, he wanted to keep enjoying the party.
He said that he wanted to keep drinking.
That's what he said, although I didn't really see him drink after that.
Well, let's talk about what you saw. Instead of going upstairs to rest, you saw Mr. Petrillo go to the bar.
We went together, yes.
And Mr. Petrillo ordered tequila shots.
Yes, but I didn't see him drink any.
Well, you say you didn't see him drink any, but you weren't watching him that whole time.
Not like a hawk, no, but I was right next to him the whole time at the bar.
Well, you were focused on a conversation with someone else.
That's right, I was talking to my friend who was also right next to us.
When you looked back over at Mr. Petrillo, he was slumped over in his chair.
He was, yes.
You don't know how much Mr. Petrillo drank when you were not watching him.
I don't think he drank anything.
Bringing you back to my question, you don't know how much he drank when you were not watching him.
I couldn't say for sure how much or if at all.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Grant, do you have anything on redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, permission to proceed.
Go ahead.
Ms. Rodriguez, opposing counsel asked you a few questions about what Mr. Petrillo drank that night. When was the last time you saw Mr. Petrillo take a drink?
It would have been 11:45 at the latest. After that, we were at the bar, and like I said, I didn't see him drink anything there.
And over the course of what period of time did Mr. Petrillo consume those drinks?
Oh, it was throughout the whole rehearsal dinner, which was pretty long, maybe 5 or 6 hours.
Thank you for your time today, Ms. Rodriguez. Your Honor, nothing further. And if there's no recross, I'd ask that Ms. Rodriguez be excused.
Let me check on recross first. How's that sound? Mr. Horowitz, do you have anything on recross limited to what we just heard?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you. In that case, the witness is in fact excused. Thank you very much. Give us a moment. Does the plaintiff have another witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Sam Arnold. May I proceed?
I can't see from my screen. Mr. or Ms. Arnold, I can't see from my screen because it's really small. You've been previously sworn, and I'd ask you to stay centered on your camera and keep your voice up so that everybody in the Zoom world can see and hear you. Thank you very much. Mr. John Mohammed, go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Sam Arnold. I'm a caterer here in Midlands, and well, I was meant to be the caterer for Genesis Petrillo's wedding to Casey Soto back in June of 2019.
How'd you get started as a caterer, Mr. Arnold?
Well, it all began when I was a child. I started watching Gordon Ramsay on the telly when I was about 12 years old. And let me tell you, I loved him. Next thing you know, I was in culinary school in the UK. But the food wasn't very good in the UK, so I moved to France. And then I couldn't cook the food in France, so I came to Midlands. And finally, everybody loved my food, so I started a catering business.
All right, Mr. Arnold. Do you know the defendant, Harper Martini?
Yes, Ms. Martini runs Peony Estates. She first hired me to cater a party all the way back in 2016, and I've been catering events for her ever since. In fact, her daughter's wedding rehearsal was one of the last in-person events I got to cater.
Let's talk about June 7th of 2019, the day of that rehearsal dinner. Were you at Peony Estates that day?
Of course. I stopped by late in the morning and I went straight to the kitchen to get the food prepared.
Did you see the defendant that morning?
Yes, I did. Harper was in the kitchen that morning working with some bottles of wine.
Did the defendant tell you who those bottles were for?
Harper said they were gifts for the wedding party, and then she instructed me to bring them out at the end of the rehearsal dinner.
Did you recognize the bottles of wine that the defendant was working with?
Most of them, almost all of the bottles Harper had in the kitchen that morning were Peony Estate's sort of house wine. It's called Horizon, but there was one bottle I had never seen before. It was labeled Cara.
Would you recognize a picture of that bottle, the Cara, if I showed it to you?
Yes, I think I would.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is screen sharing a picture of Exhibit 2A and 2B. They're already in evidence.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Arnold, is this a picture of that bottle that you were just talking about?
Yes, it is.
You mentioned that you hadn't seen this bottle before. Did you ask the defendant about it?
I did. Harper told me it was a special blend that she'd been working on for months. A new blend that she told me to give to Genesis.
Did the defendant tell you anything else about this wine?
Yes, but then Harper told me that the bottle would take care of her problems forever.
Thank you. We can take those exhibits down. Now, Mr. Arnold, earlier you mentioned that the defendant instructed you to give that Cara wine to Genesis Petrillo. Did you two discuss Mr. Petrillo again?
Yes, actually, I was sort of leaving the kitchen, so I turned around to say goodbye to Harper. Well, that's when I noticed this canister labeled pesticide on the counter. So I asked Harper, what's that canister of pesticide for? And she looks at me and says, to kill pests like Genesis. And I sort of just stared at her. And then she goes, just kidding, of course, as if that made it any better.
Okay, Mr. Arnold, you told us what you saw and heard before that rehearsal dinner. Now let's move to the dinner itself. Did it go as planned?
Well, obviously what happened afterwards was a tragedy. But the dinner itself went by just fine. Towards the end of the night, I got all those wine bottles Harper wanted to give the guests ready so we could finish things off.
And did you give that bottle of Cara wine to Mr. Petrillo like the defendant had instructed?
Yes, Harper stood up to give a toast and I came in with the bottle.
Did you hear the defendant tell Mr. Petrillo anything about that wine?
Yes. Harper stood up and announced to the whole wedding party that that Cara wine was just for Genesis.
What did you do after the defendant made that announcement?
I mean, I brought the wine to Genesis. And then Harper said that Genesis should drink the wine alone.
Did you hear the defendant tell any of the other guests to drink their wine alone?
When I gave the other bottles of wine to the other guests, Harper didn't say anything of the sort.
And after Mr. Petrillo received that bottle, did you ever see him again?
No, I went home soon after. By the next morning, Genesis had already passed away.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Arnold. Nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Okay,
Cross-examination, Your Honor.
sure, just a moment, Mr. Wilson.
Of course.
Have at it.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Arnold. My name's Michael Wilson, and I just have some more questions for you on behalf of Harper Martini.
Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson. If I can be of any help, just go ahead and ask.
Well, let's get straight into what you mentioned to Mr. Jah Muhammad a couple minutes ago. Now, you said you saw Miss Martini in the kitchen and some pesticides were on the counter, correct?
Right, there was a canister of pesticide on the counter.
And you said that you saw the car of wine in the same kitchen.
That's right.
But Mr. Arnold, I just want to clarify. That car of wine, it was a corked bottle of wine, correct?
That's right. By the time I saw it, the wine was already corked.
And you never saw anyone tamper with that bottle of car of wine.
I wasn't really watching the bottle, so I couldn't be sure, but I didn't see anything.
You never saw anyone uncork that bottle.
Other than me, when I pulled the glass out, no, I didn't.
And you never saw Miss Martini pour pesticides into that bottle of wine.
No, again, all I know is what Harper told me the pesticide was for.
Now, like you mentioned on direct examination, you gave that bottle of wine to Mr. Petrillo.
Yeah, I did.
And I just want to break that down. So Miss Martini announced she was making a toast.
That's right, yes.
She grabbed the microphone.
Yeah,
She brought Mr. Petrillo up to the front of the room.
that's right. It was a speech in front of everybody.
So in front of everybody, that's when you gave Mr. Petrillo the bottle of car wine.
That's right. Everybody was receiving bottles of wine.
And you mentioned something on direct examination. I wrote it down. You said that Miss Martini said that Mr. Petrillo should drink this bottle of wine alone, correct?
That's right.
But then Miss Martini actually instructed you to open that bottle of wine.
She did. She told me to pour a glass for Genesis, and so I obliged.
So in front of everyone, Miss Martini poured Mr. Petrillo a glass of that wine.
That's right. Just Mr. Petrie.
And Mr. Arnold, you know that Mr. Petrillo was drinking that evening.
I can't be sure. I actually don't try to monitor my guests' drinking. I just know that I served him a single glass of champagne.
Well, he drank champagne,
Yes, that's right.
and you gave him the bottle of car wine.
That's right, but I didn't see him drink it. I left right afterwards.
So you left right afterwards, correct?
That's right, at about 10:15 p.m.
So you don't know what else Mr. Petrillo might have drinking after 10:15 p.m.
That's right. If I wasn't there, I'd have no way of knowing.
And you don't know how much else Mr. Petrillo drank that evening.
I suppose not.
Thank you for your time today, Mr. Arnold. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Anything I redirect, Mr. John Muhammad?
No redirect examination, Your Honor. We just ask that Mr. Arnold be excused.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arnold. You are excused. And if you give us a moment, we'll be right with you. Does the plaintiff have any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Dr. Quan.
Dr. Quan,
Permission to proceed?
stand by, please. Dr. Quan, you've been previously sworn. I want you to keep your voice up so that everybody in the Zoom world can hear you. Stay centered on your camera so everybody in the Zoom world can see you. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Have at it.
Good afternoon, doctor. Could you introduce yourself to the court?
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jimin Quan.
Where do you practice, doctor?
Currently, I'm the chief emergency physician at River Valley Hospital. It's right here in Midlands.
And what's your medical background?
Well, I majored in biology at Georgia Tech, and I loved it so much I decided to go to med school at UNC Chapel Hill. After that, I completed a residency in emergency medicine and a fellowship in medical toxicology, both at Emory.
Let's talk about your work in today's case. How'd you get involved?
I performed 2 roles in today's case. First, I treated Mr. Petrillo when he was in the ER prior to his death. And second, I determined the cause of his death and certified his death certificate.
Let's go through each of the roles that you performed, starting with what you did as Mr. Petrillo's treating physician. When did Mr. Petrillo come into the ER? On June 8th, 2019.
He was brought in around 1 a.m.
And can you tell the members of the jury what his condition was like at the ER when he arrived?
Of course. He was slurring his speech and vomiting, so I admitted him. I also ordered some preliminary blood testing, toxicology testing, and I conducted a full physical exam before those test results came back.
Now, what did your examination of Mr. Petrillo show?
I noticed that Mr. Petrillo's pupils were contracting and his pulse was slowed down. He was also experiencing muscle spasms, wheezing, and excessive tearing.
Doctor.
Improper opinion. May I be heard?
Sure, go ahead.
Now, pursuant to Rule 702, specifically Rule 702C, an expert witness must show that their statements and opinions are the product of reliable principles and methods. Now, we haven't heard anything about the methodology that Dr. Quan used when treating Genesis Petrillo or coming to her conclusions today.
Response, Your
Counsel?
Honor?
Yeah.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, today, Dr. Quan was called to testify in 2 different capacities. First, as Mr. Petrillo's treating physician, and second, as an expert in toxicology. So far, Dr. Quan has only testified as to her role as a treating physician. In other words, what she saw and what she did. She hasn't elicited any expert opinions or conclusions, and thus Rule 702 and the prongs within actually don't apply here yet. Because of that, Your Honor, this is admissible testimony.
Based on that, I'm going to overrule the objection. It looks like at the moment she's just testifying on what she saw, but she gets a little further in. Mr. Huntley, you may want to renew your objection if necessary.
Yes, Your
Go
Honor.
ahead. Go ahead,
Yes,
Ms.
Your
Huntley.
Honor. Doctor, did you get a chance to finish your answer on what that examination showed?
As I was saying, Mr. Petrillo was experiencing a number of symptoms.
And what did you do based on those symptoms?
Well, I began to suspect that he'd been exposed to a toxin, so I started administering an antidote.
Objection, Your Honor. I would re-raise my objection to an improper opinion, as Dr. Quan just came to the conclusion that because she witnessed the statement, those symptoms, she concluded or believed that Genesis Petrillo had been exposed to a toxin.
Okay.
May
Go
I
ahead,
respond, Your
Mrs.
Honor?
Pena. Go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Quan was just saying that because she suspected a toxin, that's why she administered an antidote. She's still describing her course of treatment and action in treating Mr. Petrillo. When she starts eliciting testimony about her actual opinions and conclusions in today's case, which she eventually will, we will be laying foundation for the prongs of 702. However, again, she hasn't actually elicited a formal expert opinion or conclusion yet.
At the moment, I'm going to overrule the objection. I think we're skating pretty close to the edge of the ice at the moment, but we may be hearing from you again shortly, Mr. Huntley. I'm not sure.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Doctor, did you get a chance to finish your answer?
As I was saying, I administered an antidote, but unfortunately, Mr. Petrillo fell into a coma and later stopped breathing. I called his time of death at 9:27 a.m.
Let's move to that second role you performed in today's case, determining Mr. Petrillo's cause of death. How did you go about doing that?
I used a method known as differential diagnosis. It's one I use in almost all of my cases.
Can you tell the members of the jury what differential diagnosis is?
Of course. Differential diagnosis is a method of taking the data from lab work to corroborate the findings from medical examinations. It's the standard method in the field of emergency medicine for reaching diagnostic conclusions.
Did you apply it reliably, doctor?
I did.
How did you use differential diagnosis in today's case?
I started by reviewing those toxicology reports I'd ordered for Mr. Petrillo. Essentially, this was to confirm that Mr. Petrillo's cause of death was consistent with exposure to a toxin, as I'd suspected.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is displaying Exhibit 6, a pre-admitted copy of Mr. Petrillo's toxicology reports. Doctor, what did these reports find?
The reports found that Mr. Petrillo's blood and stomach contents were both positive for isofenfos. Now, that's a common organophosphate pesticide.
You just mentioned the word organophosphate. Can you tell the members of the jury what that is?
Certainly. Organophosphates are a type of chemical compound usually found in commercial pesticides. As an ER doctor, though, I see them most often in patients who've been exposed through household products, things like pet flea medications and flame retardants.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is displaying Exhibit 7, a pre-admitted copy of Mr. Petrillo's death certificate. Doctor, what did you conclude was Mr. Petrillo's ultimate cause of death?
I concluded that Mr. Petrillo's cause of death was a respiratory failure due to organophosphate poisoning.
Did you ever consider alcohol poisoning as a potential cause of death for Mr. Petrillo?
I did initially. Some of Mr. Petrillo's initial symptoms were consistent with both alcohol and organophosphate poisoning, but I was able to rule that out.
How were you able to rule out alcohol poisoning as a potential cause of death?
A number of reasons. First, Mr. Petrillo's blood alcohol concentration was 0.16, which is significantly lower than the required threshold for a fatal alcohol poisoning. Secondly, while the initial symptoms were consistent with both alcohol and organophosphate poisoning, only Mr. Petrillo's later symptoms were consistent with organophosphate poisoning.
Let's talk a little bit more about Mr. Petrillo's official cause of death, organophosphate poisoning. It says here that Mr. Petrillo most likely ingested organophosphates through contaminated wine he drank on June 7. How were you able to determine that, doctor?
Based on my review of Ms. Rodriguez's report, I know that Mr. Petrillo consumed wine from a bottle of Peony Estates' Cara wine around 10 p.m. on June 7th. Now, this was corroborated by the toxicology report, which found that Mr. Petrillo's stomach contents included liquid, predominantly wine, which contained pesticide.
Did you find any evidence that a bottle of Cara wine had pesticides in it?
I did. I reviewed a toxins analysis for a bottle of Cara wine.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is displaying Exhibit 10, a pre-admitted copy of the toxins analysis of that Cara wine bottle. Dr. Quan, what did this analysis find?
It found that the bottle of Cara wine was contaminated with isofenfos. Now, that's the same kind of pesticide I found in Mr. Petrillo's blood and his stomach contents.
Thank you, Dr. Quan. Your Honor, at this time, I have no further questions.
Okay. Just a second, Mr. Huntley. We'll be right with you.
Of course, Your Honor.
Okay, I'm guessing you'd like to cross-examine this witness. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Have at it.
Of course. Good afternoon, Dr. Quan.
Good afternoon.
My name is Adrian Huntley. I have some more questions for you on behalf of Harper Martini.
Of course. Nice to meet you, sir.
It's nice to meet you as well. Now, I'd like to jump right in with your conclusion. You think that Genesis Petrillo passed away as a result of ingesting a pesticide?
That's my expert conclusion in today's case. Yes.
And part of the reason you think this is because you found traces of pesticide in Mr. Petrillo's system?
That's right. The toxicology testing found that Mr. Petrillo had ingested a severe quantity of pesticide.
But doctor, you can't actually tell us the amount of pesticide found in Mr. Petrillo's system.
That's right. We currently don't have medical tests that allow us to determine a specific quantity, but I know from a binary test we run that it was a severe organophosphate poisoning.
But doctor, that's a yes to my question. You can't tell us the amount of pesticide found in Mr. Petrillo's system.
Right. I can tell you the degree of poisoning, but not the specific amount.
Now, initially, you didn't think that Genesis Petrillo was suffering from pesticide poisoning at all.
That's right. I initially suspected it was alcohol poisoning, which is far more common.
Let's talk about why you might have suspected that. Now, you're aware that Genesis Petrillo had been drinking on the night of June 7th.
Yes, that's what Ms. Rodriguez informed me of when they came into my ER.
In fact, you know he drank a lot that night.
I couldn't tell you a precise number of drinks he'd consumed, but Ms. Rodriguez indicated that he had been drinking.
Well, when Mr. Petrillo came into the ER, he appeared severely intoxicated.
That's right.
You could smell alcohol in his breath.
I could, yes.
He was exhibiting several symptoms of alcohol poisoning.
Right. His initial symptoms were consistent with alcohol poisoning.
So later that evening, you tested Genesis Petrillo's blood alcohol content.
I did at around 2:58 a.m.
And you found that he had a BAC of 0.16.
That's correct.
Now, you'd agree with me that a BAC of 0.16, that's in the high risk level.
That's correct. It is.
I just want to make sure we get the timeline right here. So as you just mentioned, you tested Genesis Petrillo's BAC around 3 a.m.
That's right.
But you know that Genesis stopped drinking sometime around midnight.
That's correct. From my review of Ms. Rodriguez's report, it would appear that Mr. Petrillo stopped drinking before midnight.
So you tested Genesis Petrillo's BAC hours after he had his last drink.
That's true.
So doctor, you'd agree with me that Genesis Petrillo's peak BAC, that could be higher than 0.16.
It could be a little bit higher, yes.
Doctor, you actually found evidence that Genesis Petrillo could have had a BAC far higher than 0.16.
That's not correct, sir.
Let's talk about that. You'd recognize the alcohol impairment chart that you provided the court in your expert report?
Certainly.
Your Honor, my co-counsel is now screen sharing what has been marked for identification as Exhibit 23. Dr. Quan, this is the alcohol impairment chart that you provided the court.
That's right. It's from the Midlands County of Public Health.
This diagram appears fair and accurate.
Yes, it does.
It hasn't been changed or altered in any way.
It hasn't, sir.
Your Honor, the defense moves Exhibit 23 into evidence.
Any objection from the plaintiff?
No objections, Your Honor.
Admitted without objection. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Doctor, this chart describes the different symptoms of alcohol poisoning.
That's correct. The symptoms in relation to the blood alcohol concentration at which they occur.
That's right. It shows which symptoms can be caused by different BAC levels.
Exactly.
And you'd agree that Genesis Petrillo's symptoms are consistent with the BAC higher than 0.16.
They're consistent with that BAC, but I don't believe they were caused by that BAC.
Well, you'd agree that Genesis Petrillo had incontinence.
That's true.
He was vomiting heavily.
That's correct.
He was unable to walk.
That's also right.
Now, all of those symptoms are consistent with a BAC above 0.26.
That's correct.
Later that evening, Genesis Petrillo slipped into a coma.
He did, unfortunately.
No, that's
Objection, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
More prejudicial than probative under Rule 403 of the Midlands Rules of Evidence. May I be heard?
Go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, opposing counsel is talking about the symptoms that Mr. Petrillo experienced at the ER when his BAC was tested. And when his BAC was tested, it was found to be 0.16. And thus opposing counsel's attempts to analogize his symptoms to this BAC curve that are actually inconsistent with the testimony already on the record
is more prejudicial than probative, and it's barred under Rule 403 of the Midlands Rules of Evidence.
Mr. Huntley, what say you?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, in order for testimony to be held out under Rule 403, its prejudicial effect must substantially outweigh any probative value. Now, right now, I'm going over the symptoms that Genesis Petrillo exhibited on the night of June, or rather the morning of June 8th, with the treating physician of Genesis Petrillo. This is cross-examination. If Dr. Quan believes that these symptoms do not line up with Genesis Petrillo's BAC, then she can say as much.
I'm going to overrule your objection and let Mr. Huntley proceed with his cross-examination. You may further address this graph on redirect if you choose, Ms. Fenio. Thank you very much. Proceed,
Yes,
Mr.
Your Honor.
Huntley.
So, Dr. Quan, Genesis Petrillo slipped into a coma that evening.
That's correct.
Now, that's consistent with the BAC above 0.35.
It is, although Mr. Petrillo's BAC at that point was 0.16.
Doctor, you'd agree with me that Genesis Petrillo exhibited numerous symptoms consistent with a BAC that could be fatal.
There's some degree of overlap between reported symptoms, yes, but blood alcohol concentration tests don't lie.
Doctor, I'm just looking for a yes or a no. Genesis Petrillo exhibited numerous symptoms consistent with a fatal BAC.
Technically, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Quan. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay. Anything on redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, permission to proceed.
Have at it.
Dr. Quan, on cross-examination, opposing counsel talked to you a lot about Mr. Petrillo's symptoms and its correspondence to an alcohol impairment chart. Now, when Mr. Petrillo was suffering from seizures and a coma, was his BAC consistent with what it needed to be on that chart to be alcohol poisoning?
Absolutely not. As you can see from that chart, Mr. Petrillo's BAC at the hospital was 0.16. Those more severe symptoms were consistent with organophosphate poisoning. Additionally, Mr. Petrillo was experiencing a host of symptoms entirely inconsistent with alcohol poisoning. Slowed speech, a rapid pulse, things like that are inconsistent with alcohol poisoning.
Thank you, Dr. Quan. Your Honor, nothing further.
Okay. Mr. Huntley, anything on recross?
No recross, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you very much. Doctor, you're excused.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff rests our case in chief, and we request a brief 5-minute recess prior to continuing on.
Sure. Hang on just a second while we do a little administrivia here.
Of course, Your Honor.
Don't want to forget who did what. Okay. Okay. Nope. So you rest and you're requesting a brief break. Timekeepers, my little clock on my computer says 1:18, which is exactly an hour since we started. Do we have time for a 5-minute break, do you think? I believe so from timekeeper. Okay, we're going to come back when my little clock on my computer says 1:23. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
Sounds
Your
great, Your Honor.
How's my arithmetic? Is that correct?
Honor. I think so.
Yes,
Okay,
Your
great.
Honor.
See you then. Judges doing okay?
Yes, doing well here.
Okay, great. Monica, are you a senior judge? You have an S in front of your name.
No, it just stands for scoring judge.
Oh, okay, okay,
Not to be confused with the presiding judge, Your Honor.
okay, no problem. See you in a few minutes.
All right, thank you.
Okay, is everybody back in the room?
The defense is here and ready to proceed, Your Honor.
How about the plaintiff?
As is the plaintiff, Your Honor.
Okay, and my colleague judges.
I'm back, Monica.
Okay,
I'm also back.
okay, thank you,
And
Caitlin.
I'm back as well.
Okay, we're all set to go. I guess, is the defense ready to call any witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Ms. Austin Lewis to the stand.
Ms. Lewis, you've been previously sworn. I want you to keep centered on your camera on your little computer. Keep your voice up so everybody in the Zoom world can hear what you have to say. Have at it.
May we proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury? Oh, Ms. Lewis, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, hello there. My name is Austin Lewis.
No worries, Ms. Lewis. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I would love to. I was raised in vineyards all over the world by my parents, who both love wine. But if there's one thing that I love more than wine, it's animals. So I decided to travel across the pond to London to study zoology. Since then, I've traveled all around the world looking for the most endangered of species.
Well, how did you end up in Midlands?
Well, I'm currently looking for a creature of zoology legend, the screaming swamp frog. Now it's small, endangered. Frankly, no one knows if it exists. But after 7 years, I think I've finally narrowed it down to within a 7-mile radius of Peony Estates. So while I search for it, I'm working there.
What's your job at Peony Estates?
Well, like I said earlier, winemaking has been in my family for generations, so I know a thing or two about wine. While I'm searching for the frog, I'm working as the head winemaker at Peony Estates.
Do you know why you're testifying in court today?
I do. I heard that Genesis Petrillo passed away at Peony Estates, so I'm just here to help however I can.
Well, I'd like to talk about your work as head winemaker. What are your responsibilities?
What aren't my responsibilities? I handle every centimeter of the winery, from the growing to the harvesting to the fermenting to the bottling, just in case I managed to spot a frog along the way. Now, admittedly, it's been 5 years and I still haven't seen one, but it's important to not give up hope, Mr. Wilson.
I'm sorry to hear about your troubles, Miss Lewis, but how do you begin producing one of those wines at Peony Estates?
Well, we start off by growing the grapes in the vineyard. Unfortunately, there are a lot of bugs who love to eat our grapes. Now, I've tried screaming at them, like the swamp frog might, but unfortunately, that doesn't seem to deter them in the slightest.
Do you do anything else to protect your grapes from those bugs?
Well, obviously. When I realized my more organic methods weren't working, we had to switch to chemical pesticides. So now we spray our vines with that to make sure that the bugs don't come back.
Do you use this process for all the wines you make at Peony Estates?
Of course. I personally supervise every spraying, and our production practices for the wines really never change.
Miss Lewis, I know this might seem like a strange question, but do you know if any of the wines at Peony Estates contain pesticides?
I do, actually. A few years ago, I think it was 2018, an FDA inspector came by and tested about 20 of our wines for pesticides. So I received the reports for that later.
Would you recognize those reports if I showed them to you today?
Of course I would, yes.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is screen sharing what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 9 with the witness under Stipulation 3. Ms. Lewis, what am I showing you?
Well, those are those reports from the FDA in 2018.
And what did you learn from these reports?
Well, the report told us that our wines had a high level of isofenfos.
Ms. Lewis, what is isofenfos?
Oh, it's a chemical in our pesticides. It's what makes them dangerous. So we have to make sure to be very careful with it.
Were you still allowed to sell these wines?
Oh, of course. Listen, I know it might seem alarming that it says high, but if you look at the bottom of the report, high is still within the FDA safety standards. So we were perfectly free to sell all of those wines.
Thank you, counsel. You can take that down. Ms. Lewis, have any of your production practices changed since 2018?
No, not a single one. I am a creature of habit.
So did those practices go into the making of the 2019 Cara wine?
Yes, we produced the Cara wine just like we've produced every other wine since we opened.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper character evidence under 404B. May I be heard?
Sure.
Opposing counsel is eliciting the testimony that Ms. Lewis used the same production processes in 2018 and 2019 in order to show that the wine in 2019 also had pesticide in it. At this point, there's no foundation on the record that that's actually the case. And as such, they're using this testimony for propensity purposes.
Response, Your Honor?
Go ahead, Mr. Wilson.
Your Honor, under Rule 406, this has already been established as a standard practice, that the practices that went into making that 2018 wine, which produced pesticides in the wine at a safe level, also went into the 2019 Cara wine and every wine produced at Peony Estates. Now, since it's a standard practice, it is not character evidence.
I'm going to agree with Mr. Wilson and overrule your objection, Mr. John Mohammed, but allow him to proceed. Go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Lewis, I think you were describing to us, did those practices go into the making of the 2019 Cara wine?
No, as I said earlier, we produced the Cara wine just like we've produced every other wine at Peony Estates.
Thank you for your time today, Ms. Lewis. At this point, I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Hang on just a second, please.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. John Mohammed, have at it.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Lewis. My name's Azam John Mohammed, and I'm going to be asking you some questions on behalf of the estate of Genesis Petrillo. If at any point you can't see or hear me, I'd ask that you feel free to interrupt me and let me know. Does that sound okay?
It does. Thank you, Mr. John Mohammed.
Okay. Now let's start by talking about what you told us on direct examination. You talked about a test of the wine from 2018 at Peony Estates. And in that test, you told us that there were acceptable levels of pesticide in that wine.
That's right.
And now, Ms. Lewis, I want to make something clear for the members of the jury. The only way to know how much, if any, pesticide is in wine is to conduct a forensic test.
That's right. You must conduct a forensic test on all of the liquids of the wine.
With that in mind, let's talk about the 2019 Cara wine. Now, that test you mentioned on direct examination, that was from July 12th of 2018, right?
Yes, when the FDA came by.
And the grapes for the 2019 Cara wine were harvested the next month, in August of 2018.
Yes, they were.
So that test you talked about on direct examination, it's not of the Cara wine. It was of a previous wine, right?
Yes, that's correct. It was of our 2018 wines. The Cara is a 2019 wine.
Now, Ms. Lewis, you're not familiar with any of those forensic tests that show that the Cara wine had any pesticide in it during the production process.
No, not during the production process.
In fact, you're not familiar with any tests of Peony Estates wine, with the exception of that July 12th, 2018 test that showed that Peony Estates wine had any pesticide in it.
That's right. No others were conducted.
Okay. Now let's talk about your relationship to Peony Estates. Ms. Lewis, you'd agree with me that you were hired to work at Peony Estates in 2015.
That's right. Yes.
You were hired by the defendant.
I was. She gave me a 10% stake of the winery, which was nice.
We'll get there in a moment, ma'am, but you were hired by the defendant.
I was, yes.
And you've known the defendant since 2012.
That's correct. We worked at an old winery together when I was also searching for the frog.
So that's a yes. You knew the defendant since 2012, ma'am?
Yes.
And like you mentioned, when you were hired at Peony Estates, you received a 10% stake in the business.
That's right.
Now, Ms. Lewis, it's your belief that if the defendant is found liable today, Peony Estates will likely shut down.
Well, honestly, yes. With all the attention this case has been getting in the media, I think Peony Estates will likely shut down regardless. But at least it will give me some more time to play croquet. You'd be surprised how many Brits there are in Midlands.
Well, Ms. Lewis, that's not what I asked you. I asked you if the defendant is found liable in today's case, where you're testifying for the defense. If you believe...
Objection, Your Honor, at this time to relevance, if I might be heard.
Yeah, what's the objection?
Relevance, Your Honor?
Give me a little more there, Mr. Wilson.
Of course, Your Honor. The witness just testified that regardless of whether or not the defendant is actually found liable, she still believes that the winery will shut down. Any potential bias that might come out of today's trial is negated because she believes it will shut down regardless, meaning this makes no fact or matter more or less likely and is not relevant.
Mr. John Muhammad?
Yes, Your Honor. This goes directly to the witness's bias and credibility. I'm asking her directly that if she believes the defendant is found liable in today's case, Peony Estates will likely shut down. I haven't asked her about any other circumstances under which Peony Estates might shut down, and this directly goes to her bias and credibility in testifying in today's case.
I'm going to overrule the objection. It's cross-examination. I'm going to give Mr. John Muhammad a few more inches of rope and see what he can do with it.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Lewis, was that a yes to my question? You believe that if the defendant is found liable in today's case where you're testifying on her behalf, Peony Estates will likely shut down?
Yes, whether she is or isn't, I still think it will.
Okay. But Ms. Lewis, Peony Estates shutting down, that's the last thing you want to happen.
Yes, I would hate to lose time to look for my precious frogs.
Okay, Ms. Lewis. Let's talk about the defendant's relationship with Genesis Petrillo. Now, you know that Mr. Petrillo was supposed to get married to the defendant's daughter, Casey Soder.
That's right.
You know that that wedding was supposed to be at Peony Estates.
It was.
And you know that the defendant and Mr. Petrillo, they didn't get along.
No, they did not.
In fact, the defendant told you that she hated Mr. Petrillo.
Yes, she said that.
The defendant said she hoped that that wedding would be called off.
That's right. No one was ever good enough for her daughter.
That's a yes to my question. The defendant said she hoped the wedding would be called off.
Yes, she did.
In fact, the defendant told you that if she could make Mr. Petrillo disappear, she would.
Yes, I believe that she said that.
Thank you for your time, Ms. Lewis. Nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Mr. Wilson, you got anything on redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just ask that this witness be excused.
Ms. Austin, you're free to go. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Give us a few moments here, please. Okay, does the defense have any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Renee Cannon to the stand.
Dr. Cannon, you've been previously sworn. I'd like you to stay centered on the camera on your electronic device. Keep your voice up so everybody in the Zoom world can hear what you have to say. Mr. Horowitz, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Renee Cannon.
What do you do for a living, Dr. Cannon?
I'm a doctor with a specialization in toxicology and pharmacology. But right now, actually, I'm a consultant at Gardner Consulting.
How are you involved in today's case?
I was hired by the defense to assess the findings of Dr. Jimin Quan, who is the treating physician for Genesis Petrillo in today's case.
Before we get into those details, could you tell us some more about your educational background?
Yes, of course. I got my Bachelor's of Science from The Ohio State University. And no, I don't want to talk about March Madness right now. But other than that, I got my MD from Harvard Medical School with an emphasis in toxicology.
What experience do you have working in the field of toxicology?
I worked at Massachusetts General Hospital for about 9 years, 3 of those as the director of toxicology. And there I would treat patients suffering from all kinds of poisonings on a daily basis.
Let's shift now and talk more about today's case. Did you have sufficient facts and data to come to any conclusions?
I did. I had Dr. Quan's final report and a variety of supplementary materials, including an alcohol impairment chart, some toxicology reports, and an eyewitness account. And I used all of these materials to come to my conclusions for today's case.
Did you use any methods to analyze the information you received?
Yes. Now, I used what we call the Schaufflich method, named after world-renowned toxicologist Alexander Schaufflich. Now, the Schaufflich method just asks us to compare evidence, like the treating physician's final report, to those supplementary materials I mentioned earlier, in order to see if there are any alternate explanations for a case.
Is the Schaufflich method reliable in your field for these types of analyses?
It is. The Schaufflich method is considered the gold standard in toxicology for comparative analyses, and it's been peer-reviewed by numerous toxicologists in my field.
Did you use the Schaufflich method reliably in today's case?
Yes, of course.
I'd like to talk now about your review of Dr. Quan's report. Can you remind us, what did Dr. Quan conclude?
Dr. Quan concluded that Mr. Petrillo passed away as a result of pesticide poisoning from the wine that was found in his system. But I actually took issue with that conclusion.
What issue did you take with that conclusion?
Well, first, I just want to say that I, of course, respect Dr. Quan's work, but I don't actually think that any medical professional can come to a definitive conclusion on Mr. Petrillo's cause of death. And that's because we're missing key information like knowing the peak blood alcohol concentration, which would allow us to determine if Mr. Petrillo might have suffered from alcohol poisoning instead.
You mentioned the phrase peak blood alcohol concentration. Can you explain what that means?
Of course. So peak blood alcohol concentration, or peak BAC, is the highest amount of alcohol someone has in their system on a night they've been drinking. And we need to know that number in order to determine if someone has a lethal amount of alcohol in their system.
So over a night of drinking, when does someone's BAC usually peak?
BAC usually peaks 30 minutes to an hour after someone stops drinking. But once BAC hits that peak, it'll steadily start to decline from that point. And that's why the timeline that Dr. Quan took Mr. Petrillo's BAC at is just so important. And I've actually brought a demonstrative to make that a little bit more clear today.
Your Honor, my co-counsel is now sharing Dr. Cannon's demonstrative aid.
Okay.
Dr. Cannon, can you explain what we're looking at here?
Sure. So this is a timeline of Mr. Petrillo's drinking on June 8th. Now we know that Dr. Quan took Mr. Petrillo's BAC at around 3 in the morning, and that measurement came back as 0.16%. But there's some key information that leads me to believe that that 0.16% wasn't actually Mr. Petrillo's peak BAC.
What was that key information you mentioned?
Well, we know from Angel Rodriguez that Mr. Petrillo had an ambulance called for him at 12:42 in the morning. So we can assume that Mr. Petrillo stopped drinking at or before that point.
How does that time relate to peak BAC?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, BAC usually peaks 30 minutes to an hour after someone stops drinking. So for Mr. Petrillo, that would be between 1:15 to 1:45 in the morning. But Dr. Quan didn't measure Mr. Petrillo's BAC until well after that potential peak window at 3 in the morning.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, in blue on this demonstrative, opposing counsel has a region that's labeled 30 to 60 minutes after Mr. Petrio's last drink. And that's when opposing counsel claims Mr. Petrio would have experienced his peak BAC. However, Your Honor, there's no foundation on the record that that time frame is actually representative of when Mr. Petrio had his last drink and what would have been 30 to 60 minutes after that. In fact, Your Honor, there's actually testimony on the record from Angel Rodriguez that Mr. Petrio had his last drink long before that ambulance was called. And thus, for opposing counsel to put this time frame on the map lacks foundation. And without that foundation, it is misleading to the members of the jury, given its inconsistency with prior testimony in court today.
Mr. Horowitz, go ahead.
Your Honor, yes. I actually agree with opposing counsel that it is possible, if not probable, that Mr. Petrillo stopped drinking much earlier than 12:42 a.m. And this simply represents when Dr. Cannon could definitively say that Genesis Petrillo had no more to drink. So I would be amenable right now to stipulating that this time frame is the absolute latest it could be, and it's actually possible that the time frame is even earlier.
Well, if you're willing to stipulate that, I'm not sure how we deal with the visual of the time frame between, I don't know, 1:15 and 1:45, whatever that time frame is. You don't have to stipulate that. I'm going to overrule the objection. I'm going to allow this exhibit to proceed, allow your line of questioning to proceed, and Ms. Fenyo can address whatever issues she has with this chart on cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor.
Have at it, Mr. Horowitz.
Dr. Cannon, can you say specifically what Mr. Petrillo's peak BAC was?
I can't give you an exact number because I wasn't there to test Mr. Petrillo myself. But I can say that Mr. Petrio's BAC was likely higher than 0.16%. And that's because Dr. Quan took that measurement when Mr. Petrio's BAC had likely been declining from the peak for an hour, if not more.
Thank you, counsel. You can take down the demonstrative aid. Dr. Cannon, why does it matter if Mr. Petrillo's BAC was higher than 0.16?
A BAC higher than 0.16 makes it even more likely that Mr. Petrillo's cause of death was alcohol poisoning rather than pesticide poisoning. But without knowing the definitive peak BAC or having a second blood test, neither I nor Dr. Quan can be definitive on any cause of death.
No, Dr. Cannon, you said earlier that it's likely that Mr. Petrillo's BAC was higher than 0.16% earlier in the night. Did Mr. Petrillo have any symptoms consistent with a higher BAC?
He did. There's an alcohol impairment chart that doctors in Midlands use to cross-reference symptoms with a determined BAC. And many of the symptoms that Mr. Petrillo exhibited actually fell on more severe ranges of that chart.
Would you recognize that chart if I showed it to you?
I would.
Your Honor, my co-counsel is now sharing what has already been entered into evidence as Exhibit 23. Dr. Cannon, what have I just shown you?
This is that alcohol impairment chart I just mentioned. And it's important to note that Dr. Quan's measurement of 0.16 for PAC puts Mr. Petrillo in that high-risk range.
Which of these symptoms did you note that Mr. Petrillo had?
Well, we know from Dr. Quan's report that Mr. Petrillo suffered from vomiting and incontinence. But both of these are symptoms of the severe impairment range, not the high-risk range. We also know that Mr. Petrillo suffered from a coma and later fell into respiratory arrest. But these are symptoms of the life-threatening impairment range, not the high-risk range.
Why are these particular symptoms important in today's case?
Well, these symptoms only support the conclusion that Mr. Petrillo might have had a higher peak BAC than what Dr. Quan measured it as. And this makes it more likely that Mr. Petrillo's cause of death was in fact alcohol poisoning.
Thank you, counsel. You can take down that exhibit. Dr. Cannon, what were your overall conclusions in today's case?
Well, without more information, like a definitive peak BAC or a second blood test, Neither I nor Dr. Quan can come to any definitive conclusion on cause of death. But based on Mr. Petrio's timeline of drinking, as well as his indicated symptoms, it's likely that he had a BAC higher than 0.16% and making alcohol poisoning a plausible cause of death.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Okay. Ms. Vigno, I'm guessing you'd like to cross-examine this witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to proceed?
Sure, give us about 30 seconds to just make sure we got our numbers straight.
Of course, Your Honor.
Have at it.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Cannon. My name is Meredith Fenyo. I'm an attorney on behalf of the estate of Genesis Petrio. Can you hear and see me all right?
Yes, I can, Ms. Fenyo.
If at any time during this examination you can't hear or see me, please let me know, okay?
Absolutely.
Let's start right where we left off on direct examination. Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is displaying a copy of the demonstrative that opposing counsel and Dr. Cannon just were referencing. Now, Doctor, this is a demonstrative that you used on direct examination, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, the levels of alcohol intoxication on this demonstrative, you base that off of the alcohol impairment chart from the Midland Center of Public Health, right?
That's right.
And on direct examination, you talked a lot about potential alcohol fatalities, but you actually left something off of this graph, didn't you?
I'm sorry, I'm not too sure what you mean.
Well, if my co-counsel can go to the next slide. On this graph, you left off what the Midland Center for Public Health deems life-threatening BAC, right?
That's right.
Right. That life-threatening BAC, that's from 0.35 to 0.5, right?
That's right, but fatalities can occur as low as 0.24.
That wasn't my question. I'm asking about what the Midland Center for Public Health, the chart you used to create this entire demonstrative set, and they deem 0.35 to 0.5 life-threatening BAC, right?
Yes, you're exactly right.
Okay. And on direct examination, you also mentioned that Mr. Petrio had fallen into a coma, right?
Yes, that's what Dr. Quan indicated.
Now, he had fallen into a coma after his blood draw was taken to determine his BAC, right?
That's right.
Right. So when he had fallen into his coma, his BAC was not 0.35, it was 0.16, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
All right. Now, let's talk a little bit more about alcohol poisoning as a potential cause of death, because there's actually a number of symptoms that Mr. Petrio experienced that are entirely inconsistent with alcohol poisoning, right?
Of course. While Mr. Petrio did exhibit stomach pains, vomiting, and nausea, which are consistent with alcohol poisoning, there were a few that were inconsistent.
Thank you. We can take down this demo now. Now, let's talk about what was inconsistent with alcohol poisoning. Doctor, you'd agree that Mr. Petrio had low acetylcholinesterase levels on June 7th and June 8th, right?
That's right. Acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme we look to understand pesticide poisoning.
Right. It's an enzyme used in the nervous system, true?
Yes, that's right.
Now, low acetylcholinesterase levels, well, alcohol poisoning can't explain that, right?
No, it can't.
And Mr. Petrio had constricted pupils, right?
He did.
Alcohol poisoning can't explain that.
You're right.
Mr. Petrio had pesticides in his stomach, didn't he?
Yes, that was indicated, though we don't know the exact levels of pesticide.
But there were pesticides there, right?
That's right.
Alcohol poisoning can't explain that.
No, it cannot.
There were pesticides found in Mr. Petrio's bloodstream, right?
Yes, that's right.
And alcohol poisoning cannot explain that. Yes or no?
Right. And again, we just don't know the levels of pesticide.
All right. Well, if alcohol poisoning can't explain all of those things, let's talk about why you focus so much on it on direct examination. Doctor, you're being paid $50,000 by the defense in today's case, aren't you?
That's right.
And you've testified in 35 cases before, right?
Yes, that's right.
And every single one of those 35 cases was for the defense, right?
That's right. Usually in civil or criminal cases, the plaintiff or the prosecution will hire a medical examiner or a treating physician, and the defense will usually contract out a private consultant like myself.
Doctor, that's a yes to my question. You've only ever testified on behalf of the defense.
That's right.
You're also a member of a number of pro-defense organizations, aren't you?
Yes, I have numerous medical affiliations.
You're a member of the Midlands Association for Civil Defense Lawyers.
I am.
The California Criminal Defense Lawyers Association.
I am.
And the National Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers.
I am. I'm also affiliated with the American Medical Association and the American Civil Liberties Union, amongst a few other affiliations.
Doctor, in total, you're a member of 5 pro-defense organizations, right?
That's right.
And can you tell the members of the jury what your email address is?
Absolutely. It's canon@toxdefense.com. Everyone at Gardner Consulting has that same little tagline of @toxdefense.com.
Doctor, to be clear, you're testifying on behalf of the defense today, right?
Right, I'm a private consultant.
All right. So if alcohol poisoning isn't consistent with those symptoms, let's talk about what is consistent with Mr. Petrio's symptoms on June 8th, 2019. Doctor, you'd agree that the most likely cause of Mr. Petrio's death is organophosphate poisoning, right?
That's right. While the facts are consistent with pesticide poisoning, simply because we do not have that peak BAC, we cannot rule out alcohol poisoning as well.
Doctor, directing back to my question, you'd agree the most likely cause of death is organophosphate poisoning, right?
Right, but just because it's most likely doesn't mean it's definitive by any means.
All right, and you'd also agree the most likely source of the pesticides found in Mr. Petrio's system is the Cara wine that he drank on June 7th, 2019. Yes or no?
Yes, again, but it's just not definitive.
Doctor, that's a yes to my question. The most likely source is the Cara wine.
Yes, like I said.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Anything on redirect, Mr. Horowitz?
Yes, Your Honor, but I first asked my co-counsel to bring up the demonstrative aid.
Sure.
Dr. Cannon, opposing counsel asked you about that life-threatening category, but just to be clear, what is the lowest BAC you are familiar with that resulted in a fatality?
While in my work, I've only seen a fatality as low as 0.30. Fatalities for BAC can occur as low as 0.24.
Thank you, counsel. You can take that down. Dr. Cannon, why weren't you able to definitively conclude that Mr. Petrillo suffered from alcohol poisoning?
We're simply missing too much information, like that peak BAC I keep mentioning, a second blood test, or even more medical records that would allow Dr. Quan or I to come to any definitive conclusion on cause of death.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Anything on recross, Ms. Vigno?
No recross, Your Honor.
Okay. Doctor, you're excused. If you give us just a moment, we got a little administration to do here. Let's witness 2. Does the defense have a third witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Harper Martini to the stand.
Okay. Just a second, please.
Of course, Your Honor.
Ms. Martini, you've been previously sworn. You've been here through the entirety of the trial, so you know what I'm about to say. Stay centered on your camera and keep your voice up so that we can all hear you. You may proceed, sir.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Hello, my name is Harper Martini.
Do you know why you're here in court today?
I do. My daughter Casey was supposed to get married, but her fiance passed away. They said he was poisoned and that I had something to do with it.
Before we talk more about that, I think it'd be helpful to get to know you a little better. Could you tell us what you do for a living?
Sure. I own and operate the Peony Estates Winery and Bed and Breakfast right here in Midlands.
How did you come to own Peony Estates?
Well, I had been working in another winery and I really liked it, but I just felt like I didn't have enough time to spend with my daughter. I figured opening up my own winery might give me some more flexible hours and more time to spend at home.
You mentioned your daughter. What was your relationship with her like?
We were really close. Casey's dad died right after she was born, so it was pretty much always just the two of us. I worked as much as I could to give her a good life, and it was tough. But seeing the person that Casey's become, it makes it all worth it.
When did you first meet Casey's fiance, Genesis Petrillo?
I first met Genesis when Casey brought him home in 2015.
What was your first interaction with Genesis like?
Right away, we didn't get along. We had lunch at Peony Estates, and the first thing Genesis ever asked me was if I had any better wine. Now, I know everyone has different tastes, but I put so much work into that winery. So when he said that, it upset me.
Did your relationship with Genesis ever improve?
Not really. I wanted to get along with him for Casey. I asked Genesis out to lunch. I gave the winery as a wedding venue. I even offered to pay for the wedding. But it felt like Genesis just wasn't having any of it.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I got this voicemail from Genesis one night, and it was pretty tough to hear. Genesis said that he and Casey were planning on moving to France after the wedding.
What did you do when you learned about their plans to move?
Well, I wasn't really happy with the idea of Casey leaving Midlands. So I did something I'm not proud of. I tried to split them up. I know it sounds awful, but I offered Genesis a lot of money to leave my daughter. I just wanted Casey to be able to keep her life here.
Did Genesis accept your offer?
No, he didn't. And at that point, I had to let it go.
I'd like to move on to the rehearsal dinner. Could you tell us how that day began?
Yeah, the rehearsal actually went pretty well. Casey and Genesis spent the whole night together. I mean, they barely left each other's sides. I'd never seen Casey look so happy. And honestly, it made me warm up to Genesis. You know, Casey's my only child, and if that was the person that she chose, then I had to do better. So I tried again to make up with Genesis.
How did you try and make up with Genesis this time?
Well, I had been working on a small batch of wine for the last year, the Cara wine. Casey had decided on the name. And since it was something that Casey and I had both worked on, I figured it would be the perfect gift to finally bring us together as a family.
When did you give the Cara wine to Genesis?
Well, after dinner had finished up, I got up in front of the whole room and made a toast to Genesis. That's when I gave him the bottle of Cara.
Why did you give Genesis the Cara in front of everyone at the rehearsal dinner?
Well, I knew it meant a lot to Casey that Genesis and I got along. And I wanted her to see that I would always support her, regardless of who she married.
What happened after you gave the wine to Genesis?
He took the bottle back to their table and poured a few glasses. When I looked over at Casey, she looked the happiest she'd ever been.
Do you know if Genesis drank any of that wine?
Yeah, he did.
Did you see anybody else drink that wine?
I can't be sure I wasn't really paying attention after I gave it to him. I know that Casey and Genesis had been sharing food and drinks all night, but I'm not sure if Casey had any of the Cara.
Did you see Genesis drink anything besides that Cara that night?
Yeah, I mean, between all the toasts and the celebrating, I'd seen Genesis have a few drinks that night.
Miss Martini, when did you learn that Genesis had passed away?
It was the next morning. I was helping Casey get ready when a member of the wedding party gave us the news. The look on Casey's face. It reminded me of when I lost my husband. And I would have done anything to take that pain away from her.
Thank you, Miss Martini. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Grant,
Yes,
Give
Your
it-
Honor.
give us one moment.
Absolutely.
Go.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Miss Martini. My name is Elizabeth Grant. I'm an attorney on behalf of Genesis Petrillo. Are you okay to answer a couple more questions?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, if at any point you're not able to see or hear me, please let me know, all right?
Of course.
Let's start by talking about that voicemail you got in mid-May of 2019. You told us that's when you learned that Mr. Petrillo and your daughter were planning to move to France after the wedding, right?
Yes, that's right.
Understandably, that made you upset.
Yes, it did. I was pretty angry when I found out.
Let's talk about why you were angry. You were concerned that Mr. Petrillo was going to take your daughter away from you, right?
I mean, of course, that's every parent's worst nightmare.
So that's a yes to my question. At that point, you were worried Mr. Petrillo was going to take your daughter away from you?
Yes, I feared that.
And you were concerned that your relationship with your daughter, it wouldn't last much longer because of this.
That's right. I was worried.
So let's talk about another interaction you had with Mr. Petrillo again in mid-May. Because you gave Mr. Petrillo what you said on direct was a lot of money in an attempt to split them up, right?
Yes, I did. That was not my proudest moment.
By a lot of money, you mean you gave Mr. Petrillo $300,000, right?
Yes, that was what I offered him.
You also gave Mr. Petrillo a note with this check, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
You'd recognize that note if I were to show it to you today in court.
I would.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is displaying what's not yet in evidence as Exhibit 24, constructively outside of the presence of the jury.
Certainly.
Ms. Martini, this is the note that you wrote, right?
Yes, it looks like it.
Looks fair and accurate to you.
Yes, it does.
Your Honor, at this time, plaintiff moves to enter Exhibit 24 into evidence.
Any objection to this admission?
Without objection, Your Honor.
Without objection, so admitted. Thank you very much.
Ms. Martini, I'd like to walk through some of the things you say to Mr. Petrillo in this note.
Okay.
You tell him to leave your daughter and to take the $300,000, right?
Yes, that's right.
You say, or else you'll take him out the hard way, right?
Yes, that's what I wrote. I just wanted to scare him, make him think I would object at the wedding or something.
Ms. Martini, I understand why you'd like to explain what you did. I'm just asking you what you said. You said if he didn't leave, you'd take him out the hard way.
Yes, that's what I wrote.
And then you gave him a deadline to decide.
Yes, like I said, it was an offer to call off the wedding, so the day before the wedding.
You gave him until June 7th of 2019, the same day as the rehearsal dinner, right?
Exactly, the day before the wedding.
But then on June 7th, on this deadline, Mr. Petrillo confronted you about this note and the check.
Yes, we talked about it.
And you understood on the 7th that Mr. Petrillo wasn't planning on leaving your daughter.
That's right.
Thank you. We can take that exhibit down. Ms. Martini, you understood that Mr. Petrillo wasn't going to leave your daughter the day before he died, correct?
Yes, that's what he said. He rejected the offer.
Let's move to what you did on the morning of June 8th, 2019. Because at around 2 in the morning, you went into Mr. Petrillo's room, right?
Yes, that's right. I got a call from one of my employees that someone had been taken to the hospital. I suspected it could have been Genesis because it wouldn't have been the first time he ended up with alcohol poisoning. So I went to see if he was there.
Ms. Martini, that's a yes to my question. You went into his room at 2 in the morning.
Yes, that's right, when I got the call.
You realized Mr. Petrillo wasn't there, right?
No, he wasn't.
You told us you thought he might have been in the hospital, but you didn't go to the hospital at that point, right?
No, I didn't. Like I said, it was just a hunch.
Instead, you found the bottle of wine you'd given to him earlier on the floor.
Yeah, the empty bottle was there, some other trash, that's right.
And you tore the label off of that bottle, right?
Yep, I picked it up and I threw it away.
You threw away both that bottle of wine and the label that was on it.
Yes, that's right. The bottle was empty. There was no reason to keep it.
You threw both of those items away on the morning Mr. Petrillo passed away, correct?
Yes, I did.
And you understand that that bottle later tested positive for the presence of organophosphate poisoning, right?
Yes, that's what the police told me.
Ms. Martini, that's the same type of pesticide you use at Peony Estates, right?
Yes, it's our organophosphate pesticide. It's the most common pesticide in Midlands.
It's the same type of pesticide you know can be dangerous, right?
Absolutely. It's why we take so many precautions at the winery.
The same type of pesticide you have access to, right?
Of course, I am the owner after all.
And the same type of pesticide you know can be deadly, yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you for your time, Ms. Martini. Your Honor, at this time, nothing further.
Mr. Huntley, anything on redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Have at it.
Now, Ms. Grant just asked you a lot of questions about a note that you wrote to Genesis Petrillo. Could you just tell the members of the jury why you wrote this note?
At the time, I really did think it was the only thing to do. I mean, looking back, I know it was stupid, but when I wrote that note, I genuinely thought Casey was making a mistake.
Did you still feel that way by the day of the rehearsal dinner?
I mean, that fear never fully went away, but I just wanted Casey to be happy. And when I saw her at the rehearsal dinner, it looked like she was.
Thank you, Miss Martini. I have no further questions, Your Honor. Barring a recross, I ask that Miss Martini be allowed to be excused.
Anything on recross, Miss Grant?
No, Your Honor, no recross.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Martini, you are excused. And counsel for the defense, do you have anything further, or what's the status of your case?
No, Your Honor. With that, the defense rests its case in chief. We would request a 5 to 10 minute recess before proceeding to closings.
Okay, I make it 2:11. We got 38 minutes, 37 minutes. How about if we come back at 2:15? Take a 4-minute break.
That sounds
Sound
good.
like a plan? Okay. My fellow judges, this may be an appropriate time if you're not familiar with the process to rank our witnesses because they're done, and that is at the bottom of the screen. If you're not familiar with it, there's a drop-down menu to pick the names. Okay, how are we doing? Is everybody back in the room?
Plaintiff is back and ready, Your Honor.
Okay, defense is back and ready. How about my judges? My judges, like you're my judges.
I'm back, Judge.
Okay, thank you very much.
Back as well.
Okay,
Goodbye.
okay. Sounds like everybody's here who needs to be here. So without further ado, is the plaintiff ready to close?
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to proceed?
You may have at it.
She killed for control. The question today is more likely than not. More likely than not, did the defendant intentionally poison Genesis Petrillo? Now, let's reframe that in light of what we've heard today. Is the most likely cause of death what the death certificate says? A pesticide. Is the most likely source of that poison what the toxicology report says? Cara wine. And is the most likely person responsible the one with access, with opportunity, with the motive? Is it the one who openly tried to bribe Genesis Petrillo for control? Is it the one who threatened to kill Mr. Petrillo just hours before he died? Members of the jury, we proved that Genesis Petrillo died of pesticide poisoning from the Cara wine given to him by the defendant with an intent to harm. She killed for control. So let's talk about the evidence we heard. Today we learned how the defendant was losing control in the months leading up to June 7th. He was terrified of losing his daughter to a life overseas to a man he hated. Harper Martini was desperate for control. So she offered Mr. Petrillo $300,000 to call off that wedding. When that didn't work, she took a bottle of wine, picked up a canister of pesticide, and mixed them. That wine, which was supposed to be a gift for Mr. Petrillo, it became a weapon. The weapon that caused Genesis Petrillo's death. That's why we're here today. That's why the estate of Genesis Petrillo has sued Harper Martini for battery. Now, in order for you to find the defendant liable, we had to prove three things. That the defendant acted with an intent to harm Mr. Petrillo, and in acting, the defendant caused Mr. Petrillo harm. Now, we had to prove those things to you by what's called a preponderance of the evidence. And all that means is more likely than not. Now, all of that boils down to one simple question. More likely than not, did the defendant intentionally poison the bottle of wine she gave to Mr. Petrillo? If the answer to that question is yes, that's it, members of the jury. The defendant is liable. So let's walk through who we heard from. First, you heard from Angel Rodriguez, a member of the wedding party, and Miss Rodriguez told us that on the morning of that rehearsal dinner, she saw the defendant with a canister of pesticide. A canister the defendant said was for Genesis Petrillo. Later that evening, Miss Rodriguez watched as Mr. Petrillo drank the wine the defendant had given him. And it's not just Miss Rodriguez. You also heard from the wedding caterer, Sam Arnold. And Mr. Arnold told us that on the morning of June 7th, he saw the defendant with the bottle of Cara wine and a canister of pesticide. When he asked about that pesticide, you heard this quote. The defendant said it was to kill pests like Genesis. We know the defendant killed for control. And we know for a fact that she used pesticide to do it. Because today we heard from Dr. Jimin Quan, an expert in the field of toxicology, and Dr. Quan told us that Mr. Petrillo's blood and stomach contents tested positive for organophosphate pesticide, the same pesticide found at Peony Estates and the same pesticide found in the bottle of Cara wine the defendant gave to Mr. Petrillo. She chose that wine. She poisoned it with pesticide. She told Mr. Petrillo to drink it alone, and while he was in the hospital, the defendant tried to cover her tracks by throwing that bottle away. But members of the jury, the defendant couldn't hide her actions that day, and she can't hide the truth today. She killed for control. But members of the jury, today you have the control. So when you go to deliberate, remember the defendant, her attempts to stop that wedding, her threats, her bribe, and her cover-up after the fact. She killed for control. Find her liable. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Huntley, you ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
Have at it.
May it please the court, opposing counsel, members of the jury. This was a poisoning, but it wasn't pesticides. What happened on June 8th was a tragedy. There's no other way to say it. Genesis Petrillo should have gotten the opportunity to grow old, to have kids of his own, to marry the person he loved. When something like this happens, when what should be the best day of a young person's life turns out to be their last, it's understandable to look for answers. It's understandable to try and make sense of something that's just so unfair. But in your search for answers, you have to make sure you're looking for an answer that's correct, not just convenient. Today you saw that pesticide poisoning was a convenient answer. After the passing of Genesis Petrillo, the plaintiff narrowed their view down to those pesticides found in his system. You see, just because pesticides could be dangerous, the plaintiff assumed they must be responsible. But members of the jury, in their rush to blame pesticides, in their rush to blame Miss Martini, the plaintiff ignored all of the evidence that there was another explanation. They ignored that Genesis Petrillo had been drinking throughout the evening of June 7th. They ignored that he exhibited several symptoms of alcohol poisoning, and they ignored that he could have had a blood alcohol content that was fatal. As members of the jury, this was a poisoning, but it wasn't pesticides. Now today, when the plaintiff sued Harper Martini for battery, they incurred a burden of proof. This meant it wasn't enough for them to just tell you that their story was right. They had to prove it. They had to prove that two different elements occurred. First, that Harper Martini intentionally mixed pesticides into the Cara wine given to Genesis Petrillo. And second, that Mr. Petrillo passed away as a result of drinking a contaminant found in that wine. Now, the plaintiff's counsel just said something interesting at the beginning of their closing argument. The plaintiff told you to ask yourselves what the most likely explanation was. But members of the jury, that wasn't their burden. The plaintiff didn't just have to prove that their explanation was most likely, they had to show that it was more likely than not. Now that means that the plaintiff has to prove that their explanation is more likely than every other possibility combined. That's what their burden was, and that's what they failed to prove. Let's talk about why, and let's actually start with that second element. That Genesis Petrillo passed away as a result of drinking a contaminant found in the Cara wine. Now, we actually agree that the Cara wine might have contributed to Mr. Petrillo's death, but not because of any pesticides, but because it was alcohol. You heard from multiple witnesses that Genesis Petrillo was drinking throughout the evening of June 7th. Harper, Martini, and the plaintiff's own witnesses, Angel Rodriguez and Sam Arnold, told you just as much. Ms. Rodriguez even said that she saw Genesis drinking from a flask, drinking wine, drinking champagne, and maybe even tequila shots. And Ms. Rodriguez couldn't tell us exactly how much Mr. Petrillo drank, but we know he drank so much that hours after he had his last drink, he had a blood alcohol content of 0.16. Now, that was his BAC at 3 a.m. But Dr. Cannon, an expert in toxicology, explained that someone's BAC actually decreases over time. Dr. Cannon told us that Genesis Petrillo's peak BAC, his highest blood alcohol content that night, probably came hours before his blood alcohol content was recorded by Dr. Quan. Dr. Cannon even told us that Genesis Petrillo's peak BAC could have been fatal. Now, Dr. Cannon and the plaintiff's own expert, Dr. Quan, even found evidence supporting this. Both of these experts found that Genesis Petrillo exhibited numerous symptoms consistent with fatal alcohol poisoning. But that's not the only problem with the plaintiff's story today. Now, the plaintiff didn't just fail to prove that second element, they also couldn't prove the first, that Miss Martini mixed pesticides into the Cara wine given to Genesis. Now, today, the plaintiff told you a lot about some things that Miss Martini said. You see, the plaintiff wanted you to focus on Miss Martini's words because when you look at her actions, when you look at what Miss Martini actually did on the night of June 7th, you'll see that she never thought the Cara wine was contaminated. You heard from multiple witnesses that Miss Martini gave that wine to Genesis during a speech in front of everyone at the rehearsal dinner. Now, members of the jury, I want you to really think about that. If Miss Martini poisoned that wine, do you think she'd want everyone to know she gave it to Genesis? If that wine was poisoned, she wouldn't have given it to Genesis in the middle of a speech in front of a room full of people. That's not the only issue with the plaintiff's picture. Because they also didn't want to tell you that if Miss Martini poisoned that wine, she wouldn't just be risking the life of Genesis Petrillo, she'd be risking the lives of anyone who could drink that Cara wine. And you heard today that the person closest to that bottle of wine, the person most likely to share that wine with Genesis, was Casey, the defendant's own daughter. Miss Martini told us that she saw Casey and Genesis eating the same foods and drinking the same beverages on the night of June 7th. So members of the jury, if Casey and Genesis were drinking the same beverages, does it make sense that Miss Martini would give Genesis a bottle of poison wine? Does it make sense that she would knowingly endanger the person she cared about more than anything in the world? No. Members of the jury, you heard Miss Martini talk about how much she loves her daughter. You know that she could never risk Casey's life like that. You know that she could never give Genesis Petrillo a bottle of poison wine that Casey could easily drink. Members of the jury, when you look at everything from today's trial, when you look at the eyewitness testimony that saw Genesis Petrillo drinking, when you look at the tests that showed that she had exhibited numerous symptoms of alcohol poisoning, and when you look at the experts who said that she could have had a blood alcohol content that was fatal, you'll see that this was a tragic poisoning. But it wasn't pesticides, and it wasn't Miss Martini. Find Harper Martini not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Huntley.
Rebuttal, Your Honor?
Would you like to take some time for rebuttal? Just give us a moment, Mr. John Mohammed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Have at it.
Members of the jury, Mr. Huntley asked you to believe two things that aren't supported by the facts. The first is that pesticides were in Mr. Petrillo's system because as a part of the production process at Peony Estates, pesticide gets into wine. Now, Ms. Lewis told us that there is no evidence that that happened with the Cara wine. But more than that, consider this toxicology report. which shows that the bottle of Cara wine had almost double the legal limit of pesticides. What else explains that but for an intentional poisoning? Now, members of the jury, they also asked you to believe that alcohol poisoning could have caused Mr. Petrio's death, a conclusion that their own medical doctor said was unlikely. Both experts agreed that the most likely cause of death was pesticide poisoning from the Cara wine. In fact, the defense agreed to pre-admit and exhibit Mr. Petrio's death certificate, which says that the cause of death is pesticide poisoning. They're asking you to ignore the evidence, and we're asking you to remember it. She killed for control. Find her liable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. John Muhammad.